As always, this will be on all of your favorite platforms under that Lead Lag Live banner on Spotify, Apple, so on and so forth. I'm quite excited for this conversation. I've been a WWE fan for a long, long time. And as I started listening to some of Mayor Jacobs' conversations, podcasts, it really dawned on me that we can have a really interesting back and forth conversation here. So excited for this. With all that said, my name is Michael Guyett, publisher of the Lead Lag Report. Joining me for the hour is Mayor Glenn Jacobs. So, Glenn, I know a lot of people in the wrestling world know of you, but admittedly, not everybody's a wrestling fan. So maybe introduce yourself a little bit to the audience. Who are you? What's your background? How'd you get involved with the WWE? And what in the world made you think to get into politics?
Well, thanks for having me on, Michael. It's a long story, but I'll make it as short as possible. I was playing college football and looked like I would have a career in the NFL, hurt my knee pretty seriously. That basically ended my football career. I did go to the Chicago Bears camp, but I couldn't pass the physical because of my knee injury. Was looking for something else to do using my size. I still wanted to be involved in sports and athletics and kind of stumbled across professional wrestling. I'd always been a fan, but not like a super hardcore fan or anything like that. Like when I was a little kid, I'd watch. And then, of course, I was in college in the 1980s, and that was the era of Hulk Hogan and rock and wrestling, and really, really enjoyed all that stuff. I figured, man, I think I have the physical attributes to do that. So got into it, spent a few years paying my dues and riding up and down the roads before finally signing a contract with WWE. A few years after I signed that contract, they created the character Kane for me, and my life has just been spectacular because of that. I've lived a life that I wouldn't have thought possible when I was growing up. As my wrestling career was winding down, of course, I was looking for something else to do. I'd always been interested in government and politics. I am a small government conservative, so my interest is actually keeping government off my back, which seems to be harder and harder nowadays. But I figured if you don't have a place at the table, that you're on the menu. So I wanted to get a place at the table. I had an opportunity to run for mayor of Knox County, Tennessee. The mayor before me, who is now congressman, is term limited. So it's very hard in politics to win a race against an incumbent, but an open seat is much easier. So I decided to do that and won and served my first term, finished my first term up in September and started my second term.
You talk about being a small government conservative and that it's getting harder and harder to even envision a future where that's even possible to have a smaller government. I'm just curious to hear your thoughts on why is it that government keeps on getting more bloated, at least on the federal level, independent of whether it's Republican or Democrat?
Unfortunately, that's just the way things go. I think Thomas Jefferson said that the nature of things is for liberty to retract and government to expand. And of course, politicians are always looking for ways to expand their power. And I think that as our generations have passed in this country, and I'm a believer in the cyclical theory of history. Okay, I don't really think that history follows a linear path. One of my favorite books is The Fourth Turning, and it talks about cycles of history, and that's just where we are. But as we get further and further into the lifespan of our country, folks just look to government to do more and more things and demand more and more out of that. And I think it's a number of factors, but primarily it's politicians wanting more power. It's the media always pushing government as the answer to everything. And unfortunately, it's people thinking that government is always the answer and not realizing that government's often the problem.
And I think the issue also is that in asking for the government for more things, it's asking the federal government for more things, whereas the more local side, right, which you can argue is a lot more important, tends to not get as much traction and attention. Given everything that you've done as mayor, what are some of the things that even for you were surprising being in the role in terms of how you could affect people's lives locally?
I absolutely agree with what you just said as far as the powers of the federal government versus the state and the local governments. We look at Washington, D.C., we see people from Congress, president, of course, are always on TV. The news is always covering them. And I think sometimes we think that's the only level of government, and it's not. And in many cases, it's not even the most important. State and local governments have a huge impact on our lives. And there's a big difference when you look around the country, especially after COVID-19 and the different paths that states followed. And you can really now again see that the states are different and different parts of the country are different. But as at the local level, one thing, it's funny because when you're not in politics, you think, oh, you can do all this stuff. And then you get in, you realize, like, I thought mayor could do all these things. And I get in, it's like, yeah, there's a lot of stuff that I just can't do, which is actually there for a reason. Government, of course, is notoriously slow, especially compared to the private sector, but there is a reason for that. And it's to provide the maximum amount of transparency, to make sure that people have as much input as possible, and to make sure there's checks and balances. In the private sector, if I own a company or I'm CEO, I'm pretty much the dictator, right? I tell everybody what to do and they're going to do it or else. In government, it's not like that. We have in Knox County, I have essentially 480,000 shareholders that I have to answer to. So it's just different. And we are in Tennessee, we're a much more conservative area. So as far as getting in, and there's some waste and things that we could do better. Obviously, there always is, but nevertheless, I think that here there are places around the country I probably would have lost my mind when I realized, oh my gosh, there's all this stuff that I don't think that we should be doing, and we are. And here it's a little different, especially at this level, because so many things that even you think of with local and state government doing here, the system in Tennessee is such that most of that is actually handled at the state. And at the local level, there's stuff that I do, but a lot of the laws that are on the books and those sort of things, that they're really at the state level. And a lot of when people call our office, it often feels like we're giving them the number to their state representative or congressman or whatever.
So you spent a large amount of your career on the road, traveled all over the place. I have nowhere near traveled as much as you have, but I've been to 47 states, in my career. And
that's not bad.
Yeah, I'll try and catch up. But it's interesting, right? Because you always hear that line in the media that there's multiple Americas, that it's united but not really united. Just curious, as somebody who has interacted with a lot of people from a lot of different zip codes, is it really true that America really is divergent internally, or is it much more of a common ground when you actually talk to people face to face versus what you see in the headlines?
No, I think there is a major divergence, and you can see it. I mean, people out west are not the same as the people in the Midwest. I grew up in Missouri. I think Midwesterners and Southerners are a lot alike, but we're a lot different than people up in the Northeast, and it's just with our views, kind of, individuals vary. But if we were to look at, I guess, kind of accumulative or aggregate blocks, it really is. Tennessee is a very red state. We're a lot different than California. Okay. The things that go on here in Tennessee, it's night and day compared to, say, with California or New York. And I think that you can argue that's the case around the country. So I really do think there are multiple Americas. And, there are some things I think that, of course, we all do agree on, but there's other stuff that, depending on where you are in the country, the majority of folks and the government and the laws will disagree and be different from one another.
Yeah, it doesn't seem to me that that's ever going to really improve. I mean, I've always been of the mindset that the reason why you have more and more extremes in thoughts and diverging opinions is quite literally because of the internet, right? Something which was supposed to be a
Yeah.
leveler of knowledge, right, ends up being just an expression of the loudest voice getting the most attention. As somebody who's in the political field now, how do you try and deal with that? I mean, I understand, okay, the local base is more conservative and probably more homogeneity there, but how do you think other politicians try to deal with all these different opinions in a thoughtful and with integrity? That's got to be the real challenge, I would think.
Sure. That's a great question. And I do believe you're exactly right. The internet has really changed everything. I mean, I put out a tweet or a Facebook post and I'm talking about a strictly local issue and have people commenting from Australia or the UK or wherever. They actually have no idea what they're talking about, because this is something that if you lived here, you would know what I'm talking about, why I'm saying what I'm saying. But when you're saying it's the same, I mean, this stuff happens overseas and I'm like, but if I were to comment, it would just really show, and I don't mean this in a mean way, but I'm ignorant of what's going on. But I think too, people often feel that they just have to say something and comment. And maybe sometimes discretion is the better part of valor. And just if you don't understand quite what's going on, maybe you should not say anything about it. But you're exactly right. I do try to consider everyone's opinions, but I also have my own set of opinions, my own set of beliefs, which I've tried to develop through not just this is what there's a difference between thinking and believing. Okay. And it's what I think based on whatever research I've done, whatever I've read, you know, experiences that I've had. Okay. And I don't want to call it a moral compass, but it is a compass as far as, what my opinions that I formed, I stay true to those. But John Maynard Keynes, who's of course a very famous economist, I don't agree with him on very much, but I do agree with him on one quote that he had, that he said he changes his mind when he comes upon new information. And I think that's something that we should all be open-minded about, that, and I have over the years too, I've been strongly one way on an issue, and then new information comes to light, or people show me a different perspective, and I change my mind. And that's not flip-flopping or, sticking my finger in the wind. Again, that's actually analyzing the information, in this case, new information that I've come across, and using critical thinking to say, yeah, I was wrong about that, and this is actually how it should be. Or they're absolutely wrong about what they're saying, and I'm right about it. And it further solidifies my opinion on that matter.
Yeah, and it's interesting you use that term flip flopping. So in the investment field, and you have to flip flop because markets are constantly flip
Sure.
flopping in and of itself, right? So, but it's interesting because the media will inherently try to do these gotcha moments and say, "Oh, you flip flopped on this issue or that issue." But to your point, I mean, you can't have just a single rigid view without considering new information. And yet, if you consider new information, you're deemed somebody who's not consistent in viewpoint. I don't know how you get thoughtful on politics unless you give leeway for even the politicians to change their minds.
Absolutely. You can't be too dogmatic, because the world changes, and we are in a period of innovation and change. And I think that truth is immutable, right? I do believe that the world is governed by natural laws, and economics included. And you can't see economic law, but they are as powerful and unchangeable as physics, biology, chemistry, anything else. But, you have, like, with the internet, that introduced a whole different set of issues that we've ever had to deal with before. And sometimes just things change as the situation changes. And you're also always dealing with people, and people change. So I think on the one hand, you do have to have guiding principles, but you cannot be too dogmatic, because if you are and you're not flexible enough to take into account the evolving situation or a new issue or whatever, then basically your opinion becomes obsolete and antiquated and no longer applies to the situation that you're in. And you're exactly right. I think it's the same. It's the same in the economy and the same in finance. I mean, just, look at all, say, in the past few decades, all the new financial instruments that have been invented, evolved, or whatever, that didn't exist before. And those are things that in your field that you have to deal with. And you can't just say, I can apply the old rules to these new vehicles. It just doesn't work.
All right. So again, you've got the experience on the private sector side as a successful individual, and you'd mentioned on the public side that there's a lot of slowness and inefficiencies. So the whole reason my Twitter profile pic has on the right eye lumber is because housing is a leading indicator of the economy and markets. And I've had guys like Bill Pulte on the home building side talk about how there's this lack of inventory on a lot of different levels, and a large part of housing has less to do with the federal and more to do with the local and the sort of red tape that home builders have to go through, right? And complications there. So yes, there may be transparency, but there's so much minutia that the transparency ends up not really mattering much because things don't get done. You can argue. I'm just curious in terms of just what you've done locally or what you've seen locally. How do you think about regulation, especially when it comes to things that really do matter on a local level? Are you of the mindset that you need to get rid of more of these hurdles, or is it just a function of trying to make them more effective and efficient?
Both. There are some that you have to get rid of and some that you have to try to make more effective and efficient. And it's also a customer service philosophy for us. And we do not, when specifically say with home building, we don't play gotcha when with our stuff. Okay. And you hear this a lot where different jurisdictions, literally like the inspector goes out, oh, you did this wrong. And you almost have to start all the way over. And that's not what we do. We believe that our job in that case is to help people through the regulatory matrix. And you're exactly right too, with home building, especially as we see this huge escalation in the price of housing across the country. So much of that is due to government regulations at the local level and zoning regulations. Here in our county, we're working on that. We have antiquated zoning, and that has just caused all sorts of problems. We've done some stuff that is referred to as green tape instead of red tape to try to make the development process easier. I think the most important thing is that it's consistent. Okay. And it doesn't change as someone's going through it. And it has to also be fair for everybody. Okay. So those are things that we've tried to do, and also look at some of just the regulations which either outlived their usefulness or never should have been put in place to begin with. Get rid of those. And then the ones that have to remain, try to make those as commonsensical as possible, while at the same time, with our relationships with the developers and frankly everybody else, not make it confrontational, make it cooperative.
You talk about some of the aspects of antiquated zoning. I think one of the things that's also probably pretty well known is that there's a lot of antiquated technology when it comes to various government agencies. FAA had to ground all flights for a bit of time there a few days ago, and apparently FAA still in some cases is literally using a dot printer.
Yeah.
Right, for some of the stuff. Again, because you've got experience on both ends of things. Does that really surprise you? And is there a way to sort of make the government more modern in that sense? Or is it, again, just one of those things where the motivation's not really there and there's a lot of odd entrenched interests to not make things more effective?
I think you're dealing with a number of things there. One is, of course, government always wants to, despite the fact that you do have big spenders, we don't want to spend too much money. And sometimes you end up with deferred maintenance and projects that should happen, but because they are capital projects, they get put off. Okay. So that is an issue. And frankly, also, politicians they're not forward thinkers. Okay. They're generally thinking about their next election, and that's about as far as they go. So some of these systems are just like that because literally you're thinking in 4-year, 2-year cycles. When I first came into office, and this is not a criticism of anyone, it's just the way it was, our IT department, I thought, was a complete mess. It was 2018, and it felt like the IT department was in probably 2007, right? And as quickly as technology is evolving, that was unacceptable. Now, I had an advantage because I was a computer science major in school for a couple of years. So, I kind of looked at that, and not to say that I understood it, but I realized, how big an issue that was. And that was actually one of the first things I did was got some new people in the IT department. I couldn't, I'm not smart enough or know enough about that field to be able to fix it myself. But my job as mayor is to find people who can do those jobs, who can fix things and run things. And that's what we did. So yeah, that is a problem. And I think a lot of it though is, just when you live in a democracy where you're always going to have turnover in elected office, sometimes, again, politicians will think in the time frame of when is the next election instead of thinking of the time frame, okay, what do we need to do so that over the next decade or so our organization is as healthy as it can be?
So I'm fascinated by how you go from being WWE wrestler Kane to politics. I know you have a book on the transition as well. I'm curious, what was the reaction by some of your colleagues when they found out you wanted to get into politics, run for mayor? Was it one of those things where they were supportive, thought it was unusual because, you've already made it. You're already successful. You needed a different motivation, and it's a completely in some ways opposite domain. I say in some ways because there's always storylines, just like in wrestling when it comes
Yeah.
to politics.
Well, and there's a lot of politics in wrestling, and that's the thing. People say like, oh, it's a huge departure. And not really, because everything that we do in the world, unless you're only dealing with yourself, it's interpersonal relationships and it becomes political. And it's the same in wrestling. There's politics of how to persuade people that your way is the right way to go about things and get along with folks and all that sort of stuff. To my face, everyone was supportive because they're all mostly my friends, and a lot of the performers and the superstars helped me. We had a number of them come in and do campaign events and appearances, which I'll be eternally grateful for them to do. But I also think that there's probably like, what is he thinking? What is he doing? So again, I think it's one of those. It's like with your kid, right? Your kid wants to be whatever, and you're like, "Oh, that's wonderful, that's great." Follow your dreams, but in the back of your mind, you're going, "What are they thinking?" But I'll support him, and I think it was a lot of that. But again, I think that everyone is WWE as an organization is supportive of the people there being successful in whatever they do, and I love it when folks branch out, like Dwayne Johnson goes out and becomes like the number one movie star in the world. John Cena is out there doing his thing. And now, like with The Undertaker, we're seeing a different side of The Undertaker. And I just love it when we have the freedom to show people that, hey, we're not just dumb jocks. And most athletes aren't actually, but, we're actually talented people that can do other things as well. I think that's good for everybody.
And ambitious, right? I mean, if no matter what you're doing, if you're ambitious, you're going to be really focus on it, try to be successful. And if you're ambitious in one domain, it's never just limited to just one domain, right? If you have that aspect of your personality. Now, I've heard you talk about this point that you actually consider yourself an introvert, which is an interesting thing because most people wouldn't think that. I'll tell you that I myself, I like to think of myself as an introvert masking around like an extrovert, right? Because
Yep.
to me, it's a means to an end. I'm trying to grow my business, grow my own personal brand name. How challenging is it to marry the personality to the objective? Because it's not a natural thing to be out there publicly, face criticism, not get emotional about it, and still try to achieve your goals.
Well, you put it perfectly. That's actually how I think of myself too. I'm an introvert masquerading, or I guess a masked as an extrovert. And I just think that, like in this job, of course, is very important. And you say, I actually can't say it any better than you said it. In wrestling, as a means to an end, is being successful in my career. That's what I had to do. I like people. It's not that, when I get in a room full of people, I'm like, I just can't stand being here. It's just that my natural personality is such that that's outside of my comfort zone. And I would rather be by myself or with a small group than I would with a large group of people. And that's just how I am. I have found, I think it's one of those things, though, it's almost like fake until you make it, because I have found that it was very draining for me, to go out and hang out with people and do all that sort of stuff. And now I kind of do enjoy it. There are times that I don't, but I've really been able to, see the value in just being around people, I guess. So it's a lot more comfortable now than it used to be. And frankly, it's just part of life. Okay. And I think that, life is all about growing and expanding as a person. And that means you have to do things that are outside of your comfort zone. When I talk to young people, I always tell them, don't be afraid to fail, because if you don't fail, you ain't living. You're just doing you're either just doing what you're good at or what you're comfortable at. And if you're not expanding and trying different things, which you will fail at because you don't know how to do them initially and you'll make mistakes. But if you're not doing that, you will never know just all the wonderful things that life has to offer. So, you put it perfectly. It's an introvert masquerading or masked as an extrovert.
Yeah, and life is also about trying to leverage in as many ways your different skill sets. So to that end, I mean, what were some of the things that you found made you maybe more of a natural on the political end from your experiences as a WWE wrestler? In other words, what what were some of those transferable skills that actually were quite useful in this domain?
Well, sure. First of all, I'm used to being in public. So I think that it was not nearly as difficult for me as it would have been someone who's never been in the public eye before, you know. And you also have to understand that when you are taking criticism, they're criticizing a persona, just like in wrestling. Okay. They don't know me. Most of the people that criticize me have never met me, have never talked to me, just don't know me. They're criticizing something that they think I am. Okay. Or they might be criticizing a position or whatever. It's fine. But really that's, in wrestling or in politics too, we have all these politicians, they kind of have personas. And I'm not saying that that's something that they conscientiously create or consciously create. It just is, right? They just get created for them because of whatever. And it's funny because I was always tell people when I was on the campaign trail, because Kane was a victim or a villain. How do I say? Most politicians are trying to convince people that they are the person they see on TV. My job was to convince people that I wasn't the person that they saw on TV. So a little different, but that's one thing is I was already used to being the public eye. I know how to deal with the media. We go through a lot of media training in WWE, and that's important. And I think I also know how to communicate because of my experiences in WWE. WWE is all about, and professional wrestling is all about evoking emotions, eliciting emotions from the audience. And first of all, we have to realize people think emotionally for the most part. And, a lot of folks will throw statistics and all these different things. And that's just noise. Impact people is, can you touch their heart, or can you reach them in a way that tells a story? And that's what we did in WWE. So I think my communication skills, because of my time there, I wouldn't have those if I hadn't been in WWE. So, and again, it's also, I was dealing with a lot of strong personalities in WWE, and we didn't always agree on things. How can you create a consensus, or how can you persuade people to look at things from your perspective? So there were some real skills that I did learn there. And I am a true believer. Brian Tracy, the author, says that 70% of your success in life is your interpersonal relationship skills. It's not your technical skills. So even in highly technical fields, if you're a jerk, you're never going to succeed because no one wants to work with you. And for anyone that, as they're thinking about, how do I become successful, or how do I take my next step? It's all about your interpersonal relationships and your skills, and treating people like they have value and that they're important and that they have worth.
It's funny you mentioned Brian Tracy. So when I was a kid, I used to listen to the audio tapes. I was a very odd kid growing up, and the one of the things that stood out to me as a philosophy that Brian Tracy would say is that he called it the winner's edge, and he'd use this analogy of a horse race. So if you're betting on a horse that wins first place versus second place, the first place horse payout is like 10x the second place horse, even if the horse wins by a nose.
Mm-hmm.
Right, and the argument there is that the little bit of extra incremental effort, the payout is so much more than the extra oomph, right, to kind of get you over the finish line. And I do think that that's probably a commonality in politics, in wrestling. You've got to do something a little bit more, a little bit extra that everybody else isn't even considering.
Exactly right. Yeah, I remember him using that analogy of, in a horse race, even if you win by a nose, the payoff is massive compared to the second place position. It was interesting. Last night, I was actually at a conference, and the keynote speaker was Art Laffer, who's, of course, the father of supply side economics and just a great economist. And he was talking about that in regards to taxes, and how it's really, there's differences between a tax rate of 0 and 1%. As things go one way or the other, the impact becomes much more. So that's true of, I think, of almost everything in life. In wrestling, almost everyone can do moves and can do all that stuff. But what separates the superstars, the people who go on to have extraordinary careers, it's not that much. I mean, it's not like, other folks aren't doing the same stuff. It's just that they do whatever, not even a lot better, just a little bit better. And you see that in sports too, football and baseball, games of inches, right? And so, yes, absolutely. But it's all about diminishing returns too, right? You have to work so much harder to get that final edge to be superior or the best. It's not that hard, I don't think, to get to average, but to improve on that becomes very difficult.
Just to reset the room for the remaining minutes for those in the audience, please make sure you give a follow to Mayor Glenn Jacobs. And again, if you want to come up and ask questions, click that bottom left mic request button. I see a few people want to ask. Those that are in the queue, just follow me and then check your DMs and we'll coordinate on the question.
We don't have that so much over here. I know I've heard a couple stories of, whether it's a RIT or, a company that is literally developing a subdivision so they can still own the property, but then they rent. So we've seen that, but we have not seen, to my knowledge, like foreign countries doing that. And you're right. I mean, with China, that seems to be something that they're doing really around the country. And it's not just residential real estate. It's a lot of other stuff as well. So, yeah, I really, and that would be something that probably, I'm not that familiar with the issue to say, oh, we should do this or should do that about it, because it hasn't impacted us over in Knox County that much yet. But yeah, I do believe that is happening around the country, and it has become a problem. It was a mixed bag, and it was kind of a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it gave me some, got my foot in the door. And I do think that things have changed, because we have seen people like Dwayne Johnson who have been so super successful at other things. So I think the stereotype is being broken. But yeah, it does still exist to some extent, probably always will. So on the one hand, it allowed me to get my foot in the door, and I got more media and those sort of things than other people would get, because it's a novelty. But on the other hand, I had to prove to people that, I actually knew what I was talking about. So I may have had to, probably had to work harder and be better, because the bar was set higher for me to do those things, to accomplish that. That is a great question. And, so I would just have to say, yeah, it was both. It helped, but it probably hindered me a little bit. And also, I think some folks think that, oh gosh, he won mayor just because he was a wrestler and a well-known. That's not the case at all. I did have to go out and actually prove that I knew what I was talking about, and I was competent and could do the job. Great question. Yeah, man, that is a great question. And that's something I ask myself all the time. I think the reason is because the lab was shrouded in secrecy for decades. Oak Ridge National Laboratory was one of the places that they developed the atomic bomb. So obviously, and it's also, to this day, there's a lot of research that goes on for national defense. So I think that the culture there was just shrouded in secrecy. They are breaking out of that. The world's fastest supercomputer is at the lab. So they have a huge footprint in computational science. They're also doing some great work in advanced materials and advanced manufacturing. And the current head of the lab he's leaving, but he was very invested in those things, right? Of, working with the private sector. And hopefully the new director will be as well. One of the things they've done is they have a facility called the Manufacturing Demonstration Facility, and they work with the private sector on innovation coming out of the lab to get it to the final step of getting it into the market. So it is happening. It's a slow process. To me, that it's a gold mine. I mean, we have 3 just huge innovation drivers. It's the University of Tennessee is in Knoxville. Tennessee Valley Authority, when folks think of TVA in our area, it's an electricity company. It's a wholesaler. It's a power company. But their mandate is actually economic development throughout the Tennessee Valley. And they do a lot of work in that area. And then you combine it with the innovation coming out of the lab, we have just an amazing innovation package. I don't think it's been marketed very well in the end. And I think that's one of the issues. And I also don't think that in the past, leadership has worked well together. And I don't think that they've seen the benefit in everybody working together with these various parts that could just be tremendous. I mean, eventually I think that our area could rival, say, the Research Triangle or Route 128 in Boston. But it's just a matter of actually doing the work. It's interesting when you think about companies and products. You can have the greatest product in the world, and Michael, you know this, but if the company isn't very good, it's not going to succeed, and vice versa. And I think that's what we're dealing with. We had a great product, but we haven't always done the work to promote it and to do the things necessary to, as you say, realize the benefits. And then the other thing is keeping the companies and the people here and not saying, oh gosh, this is developed here, but it's going to go to Austin or it's going to go someplace else. And that's something that we're really working on, trying to have a pipeline also with talent. So if a young person goes to the University of Tennessee, gets a degree in engineering, goes to the lab, does some stuff there, we want to keep them. Okay. We don't want them to go someplace else. So those are things that we realize are important and we're working on. But I think it's really a matter of just consciously working on those things and working together to make that happen. That's a great question.
The marketing point, going back to your point, you have a great product, but the company doesn't matter, or the marketing doesn't matter. I mean, that's critical. Marketing is something you have to do, whether it's a private sector or public sector type of situation. You want to attract the right talent, the right companies to Knox County, to Tennessee in general, other than the obvious of lower taxes, right? Which is often why people and companies will move. What are some of the things that you find, again, being in the seat as mayor, attracts people from outside of Knox County, outside of Tennessee, to be a part of the community and be productive, within those borders?
Sure. Well, yeah, low taxes are important. In Tennessee, we don't have a state income tax. We have the lowest state and local tax burden in the country. Our franchise and excise tax is a little high, which is not good for corporations, but I think the state is addressing that. So the tax environment's great. We are a right to work state that was actually just codified into the Constitution during the last election. So that's important. We are a low regulation state. We're very business friendly. We're also here in Knox County. We're about 45 minutes from the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, which is the most visited park in the country and one of the biggest tourist attractions in the United States. We're also, with 60% of the nation's population lives within an 11-hour drive of our area. So when we think about like logistics companies and those sort of things, or, even if you just want to move to Knoxville, but you don't want to be in the middle of nowhere, we're not. We're also, and we're 2.5 hours to Nashville, about the same to Atlanta, about 3 hours to Charlotte. So I think that we're a big enough area that there's something here for everybody. And if you can't find it here, it's within a not terrible drive away. Our climate's also very, very moderate. I mean, we get snow. It's cold today, and we get hot in the summertime, but we don't get as much snow nearly as they do up north. And I think that I prefer our climate here. I lived in Florida for a while, and Florida is just way too hot and humid in the summertime. So we have that going for us. Our cost of living is low, like many places around the country, of course, just because of inflation and those sort of things. It's going up, but it's still very manageable. And our people are really nice. And it's funny because I heard once that every mayor in the country will say that the greatest asset that their city or area has is the people. And I always say they're all lying because we have the best people. But I really do believe that. That our people are great, and here in the South, people are just very hospitable and friendly. So we have a lot of things going for us.
Listen, I'm in New York City. The people are not that hospitable. So I can understand that. Let's go to
and Michael, if I could follow up on that too. Even before the pandemic, there was a move that folks were tired of the big cities and wanted to come to the mid-sized cities like Knoxville and other areas our size. That was really accelerated with the pandemic and people working from home. So we're seeing a lot of folks that move here, say from California, and they're actually not working here. They're working remotely, but they live here because just our lifestyle and everything is easier and better here. And hopefully some of those jobs will follow. But even what you're saying as far as living in New York City, before the pandemic, that there was a move towards the mid-sized cities, and that's just gotten more and more pronounced. I'm a big believer in regional cooperation. we really don't expand all the way down to Hamilton County. I mean, I was friends with Mayor Coppinger, who just left office. I talk pretty regularly with Mayor Womp, who just got into office in September. And as you say, along that I-75 corridor between Knoxville and Chattanooga, there's a lot of stuff happening. Ours is more specific to, say, the 16 counties in East Tennessee. And I do work very closely with the other county mayors as well as some regional organizations. The thing about it is, from an economic development perspective, and economic development really just means jobs and economic opportunity, right? And making sure that you have plenty for everybody. We're not a big enough area that Knox County could compete by itself. We're in a global market. All right. So we're not competing with Nashville or Atlanta or wherever, Dallas or Houston. We're also competing with Shanghai and Beijing and Perth, Australia, and all these different places. And the only way that we can be competitive in that global market is if we have our entire region working together on projects. And we all realize that, and that's what we try to do. Again, that's another really good question. Here in Tennessee, we are a big player in the auto industry. In fact, we're one of the leading auto manufacturers in the country. I think people still think it's Detroit and Michigan, but it's really moved down south. In Chattanooga, they have a big Volkswagen plant. In Smyrna, which is over by Nashville, they have a Nissan plant, as well as all the ancillary businesses that go along with it. In West Tennessee, Ford is building a plant to manufacture the F-150 Lightning, and it will be bigger than their operations in Detroit. I forget, but it's going to be massive. It's called Blue Oval City, and the state's has a huge commitment with working with Ford. Part of the issue is workforce, right, and getting people trained to be able to take these jobs. The assembly line is not what it once was. The jobs aren't actually working on the assembly line. The jobs are working on the robots that work on the assembly line. But yeah, we have a huge footprint in the automotive industry, as well as we're seeing a lot of interest with electric vehicles and batteries and all those sort of things. I will tell you that I'm somewhat skeptical of this huge migration to electric vehicles. I was talking with the CEO of Pilot Oil the other day about this. He's a very interesting guy. He used to work for power companies, and now he works with Pilot Oil. Pilot owns the Pilot and Flying J truck stops around the country. They're actually, I believe, the nation's largest distributor of diesel fuel. And the power requirements and distribution requirements for electric vehicles, I think some of the things that we see as far as, this huge push for everybody to go to electric vehicles, I just don't think they're feasible over the short term. I do think, over the long term, of course, the market's going to decide. And I do think that we'll have a diversity of vehicles. But nevertheless, we are seeing huge investment in Tennessee with both auto manufacturing, research and development, as well as battery manufacturing and research and development. We don't have that, not to my knowledge. I mean, maybe the state has something, and but look, the city of Knoxville is talking about more power or more charging stations, those sort of things. The counties, we're not going to get in that business. The state, I think it's the Federal Department of Transportation is providing funding for those things. I know that the state is talking about it as well. Pilot Oil, as I just mentioned, they're working of a partnership with GM to start putting charging stations at some of their gas stations and truck stops. But as far as like some sort of state plan, I don't think we have that. I could be wrong, but I haven't seen it.
I want to, before bringing in one other question here, just go back to the name of the Twitter space. I was trying to figure out the right things. I said chokeslamming politics. I made it originally chokeslamming debt and taxes. And I want to address the point about debt for a bit, because I know you're of the kind of more libertarian mindset, Austrian economics. Nobody's really a fan of taxes, but we got to pay them, obviously. But the narrative around taxes, I think, gets misguided, because when you look historically, when taxes are risen, they're never used to pay down prior debt.
Right.
They're used as justification for more spending. So you keep on having the net debt still rise, even though taxes are rising, which doesn't make any sense just mathematically. Part of that has to do with efficiency. Part of that has to do with vested interests. But again, given that you're now in it, obviously, and have been in it for a while on the political side, what are your thoughts on how you resolve broadly government debt, and how do you address that properly without choking off, what people generate from their income too much?
Sure. So again, if we think of the different levels of government, and ours is what we do debt for is a lot different than say what the federal government does. The federal government just doesn't have enough money, and they're printing money, they're going into debt, $31 trillion. At the local level, and in some now Tennessee as a state, we have virtually no debt burden. We're pay-go on roads. So a lot of the capital projects that would normally be financed with debt, they pay for. That's really the best way to do it because, for a lot of politicians, we're just going to bond this so we don't have to tax people. Well, you're taxing people in the future. And even worse, you're adding interest to the taxes that they're paying. So anywhere you can, of course, you'd want to pay for things in cash, but that's just not feasible for us. I mean, we've seen a lot of people move in here. So we have to have more schools, more roads. Those are expensive things. And, unless we just want to see our tax rate go through the roof, I think those are appropriate uses of debt. It's just like with your house, and you pay it back over a period of time. But you're exactly right. All too often taxes are used not the only time that I would be in favor of a tax increase, and I've seen other counties do this in Tennessee, would be specifically to pay down debt. Okay. And even then you have to, make sure that you have an airtight bill or legislation, which would not allow the politicians to get their grubby fingers on this additional taxes or revenue stream and use it for something else. Okay. But listening to, say, Professor Laffer last night, and he made a great point. When people say, "Oh, the tax rates or the tax cuts the federal government did, that's why we're going into debt." No, we actually saw the federal government get more revenue because they did cut taxes. And you'll see that, especially with income tax, is through history, as income tax rates have dropped, the revenue that the government gets is actually higher. It's the Laffer curve, which is named after Professor Laffer. So, high taxes are not the answer to anything. The answer is to promote economic activity. And the government gets a smaller percentage, but the activity is much more. And that's good for everybody. So really, it all comes down to, it's not a revenue issue, it's a spending issue. And figuring out how you can spend money effectively. At times, yes, you have to, especially at the local level, we just don't have that much money that we can just say, hey, we're going to spend $20 million to build a school, or we got a $20 million road project. Okay. But we do have capital plans, and we have like a 5-year plan. Well, that sometimes that changes, but it gives us a guideline of how we're going to spend our money, the debt that we're going to take out, what all those things look like. In Knox County, when we came in, we already had debt when I got here, which, obviously sometimes I think, man, why did a former mayor do that? And I'm sure that there will be future mayors that would be like, why did Jacobs do that? That was stupid. But nevertheless, our debt is actually lower per capita adjusted for inflation than it was 15 years ago, as well as our spending. So I think you can do both, but I think that controlling your spending is the key.
Let's do one or two more questions, and then we'll wrap up. Again, everybody, please make sure you follow Mayor Glenn Jacobs here on Twitter. Let's go to...
I think it's very bright. I've been a big fan of his ever since he was at Central Florida. He's a winner, won a national championship at Oklahoma. I think when he first got hired that folks were a little skeptical, and rightly so. I mean, because we had been through a number of coaches that just weren't successful. I think he brought a culture change. I think he loves the game, and I think that his kids love playing for him. And he's also an offensive genius, and if nothing else, they're fun to watch. I mean, they're going to light up the scoreboard, right? So I think the future is very bright for Tennessee football, and that has a huge impact on our economy and really just how people feel about themselves here. You can tell a tangible difference when UT Athletics we don't have a professional sports team here in East Tennessee, and they kind of are it. And you can tell a tangible difference in kind of just the way everything is when, especially the football team's doing well. So I think the future is really bright. I think so. SEC, I don't think it's any argument that they're the best conference in the country, and that'll just make them better. It's almost getting to the point, where I think there are some SEC teams that It's almost like the SEC could be a division in the NFL with all the talent that they have. But I think it will make things better and certainly more interesting. You'll still have your rivalries, long-standing rivalries, but this will allow some other stuff to develop.
Let's do one more question, and then we'll wrap up.
It's given me a lot of confidence that I can do things, because, and for me, it's not, I mean, I'm not that smart or talented or anything. I don't quit until I get where I want to go. And I think that's really the key for everybody in life. So it's convinced me that I am a competent person that can achieve things, as well as, I look back, I'm like, man, I've had a very rich life because I have done a lot of different things, and I've met a lot of great people and had a lot of different experiences. So, here's the thing, man. Don't ever tell me I can't do something, because if I want to do it and I have the skill set or can learn the skill set, I think I can do it. And I think that just doing a lot of different things in my life that's been the result. Is I'm much more confident. When I was a kid, man, think back when I was playing high school basketball, I was like, if I had the same mental attitude then that I do now, I mean, I'd have been unstoppable. But I just wasn't. I was always questioning myself: Am I this good? Am I this whatever? And so much, I think, of your success in life is really based around your self-confidence, and also just that determination and persistence until that you do not stop until you get where you want to go.
By the way, since you said that you can't do something, does that mean one last match is coming?
That might be the one thing I can't do.
Exactly. Everybody, please make sure you follow Mayor Glenn Jacobs. This was a great, fun conversation. Real pleasure for me as somebody who is a lifelong fan. I was at Madison Square Garden in 2000 for a WWE Raw show, and I happened to get the second row. So during the entire episode, you can see me as a kid cheering, and it's just funny how I had a friend of mine text me saying, "Who would have thought that years after living and watching wrestling and watching it on a basement TV, you'd be able to actually talk to Kane, in at least on a venue like this." So, real pleasure. Thank everybody for joining. I'll be, as usual, doing other spaces this week, and thank you again, Mayor Jacobs. Really do appreciate it.
Michael, thank you so much, and thank you to everybody who listened and who called in. I really enjoyed it.